Hi, thank you for joining me on Mosaic today, where we're going to be talking about women in leadership and why representation matters. We're having a conversation with three fantastic female leaders in recognition of International Women's Day on March 8th. This time on Mosaic, we're going to be talking about women in leadership, why representation matters. I'll be joined by Cynthia Westfall, Renee MacVicar, and Abby Davidson. Hi everyone, thanks so much for joining me today. I hope we're going to have a great conversation today. We're talking about women in leadership, and maybe just to get started, if we could have each of you introduce yourselves.
Hi, I'm Renee MacVicar, and I'm a associate pastor at Hillside in Moncton, and so I'm the associate pastor of community engagement.
And I'm Abby Davidson. I'm a pastor in Toronto at a church called Spring Garden, and I'm the pastor of missional discipleship there.
And I'm Cindy Westfall, and I'm a professor of New Testament at McMaster Divinity College.
Great. I'm so excited about our conversation today. As you can see, we have a powerhouse group of women here. And why we asked the three of you specifically for today's call is that we want to talk about women in leadership. And I thought you three are great representatives of women in very visible roles of leadership within our denomination. And specifically, I want to talk about why representation matters. So when I moved into the role of ED about a year and a half ago, this is something that's been brought up to me quite often, is that how meaningful it has been for other women to see a woman in a position of leadership. And you know, I think we send messages, right? We send messages when we allow women and when we enable and encourage women to be in these positions of authority and influence. Why do you think representation matters?
So I started at my church about a year ago. I transferred from another church, and the first Sunday that I was up in the pulpit, a woman reached out to me after, and she told me that her 4-year-old daughter, who they were watching on YouTube, and her 4-year-old never pays attention to church, but she said as soon as she saw you up there, she was glued to the TV, and she said, "Mama, like that's someone like me." And I think that's just the best story I can think of that shows us it matters, that we have members of the next generation, especially, they're looking to see who are the people that are leading us, who are people that are speaking. And having someone who looks like them is a very important thing.
Yeah, I agree, Abby. I think people need to see real life role models of women in leadership. They need to be able to see that they themselves could be in those roles and that they're truly equal in those roles, men and women. And I think that's part of the message that it sends, that women aren't just in sub roles or hidden roles or in the kitchen or helpers, but they see real life examples of women leading and see themselves in those examples.
Yes, agreed. There's a truism that says you can't be what you don't see. And whereas, I mean, you could say that the women here are groundbreakers, but in general, that's true, that a 4-year-old girl won't have a vision of herself acting in this way unless she sees a woman acting in this way. And other people simply will have a feeling of wrongness if they aren't exposed to it. So it's really important to place women in leadership and make them visible.
And it normalizes it, doesn't it? It doesn't seem so unusual anymore to see a woman as a pastor, as a lead pastor in a church. I think in my time when I was a child, it would have been very unusual for me. I actually didn't know there were female pastors probably until I was in my early teen years. I had never seen a female pastor before. And now I wouldn't think anything. I know so many female pastors, and I think it's quite normal. And so definitely the next generation, I think we're helping the next generation think differently about what is the norm in leadership around gender. And going back to my own church experience when I was growing up, women were only allowed to preach one Sunday per year, and it was on Mother's Day, and they called it Women's Sunday, which in hindsight is pretty funny because, you know, what are the other 51 weeks, right? I guess those are men's Sundays, but how are we doing on this in our churches now? Have you seen change? Are you seeing more balance in terms of representation? Are we being more inclusive in the roles that we're enabling women to have within our congregations?
I think we are seeing change. I think it's slow, but I think we are seeing change. And a story that brought this home for me was our daughter, who's 11, Isabel. We got her Acadia Divinity College magazine in the mail last week, and she was flipping through it and had a picture of all the graduates. And she was looking at them and she just commented, "Oh, that's interesting. There's both young and old people." And I said, "Yes." And she goes, "Oh, yeah, I guess so. Both young and old can study to be pastors and be in the ministry." And so I was waiting for the question of, "Oh, and look, there's both men and women." And what was interesting was the question didn't come, that for her, it was now normal to see women in ministry. And I'm her stepmom, so she's used to that way. And I was thinking, you know, what a change. 10 years ago, when I would have graduated from seminary, it would have been obvious how few women were in that graduating class. It would have stood out very clearly. And so I think we're seeing some changes in that way, particularly at our seminaries. 2 churches where I have served, I was the first female pastor that they've ever had. And in both those churches, I would say people needed help in exploring their biblical, re-examining the biblical passages. They'd just never seen it before. So for some of them, it was just so new, they needed to see it practically. But I say we still have a ways to go in that I see there's still positions that aren't open to women, whether it's certain pulpits or certain positions in the denomination. There's still deacons boards or elder boards, I know particularly in Atlantic Canada, that are all male. And you still encounter just strong teaching and strong attitude that's still going around that women aren't to hold certain roles and can only hold certain positions. So I think we've made progress, but there's a way to go.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Renee. I've been a pastor for 7 years now, and my experience has been very good. I've had, male pastors mentor me, and I've had churches just receive me, with a big welcome. And when I say that to other female pastors, that's not their experience for women that have been pastoring longer than I have. So I think it is changing slowly. And I think of our last ordination council examining council we had with Toronto Baptist Ministries, and we had 2 women being examined, and 2 young women. One is a lead pastor, one's a youth pastor. And someone said to me after, "I've never been to a council where it's 2 women candidates. Usually it's all male, or you have one once in a while." So I think the doors are opening up more for women. But then I hear what Renee is saying too, that, you still see positions being advertised within our denomination where they're asking for male applicants only. And it shouldn't be that way. So there's some change that still needs to happen.
I can speak from my own congregation that we have ordained women, and we have a lot of women leadership. In fact, maybe more women leadership. And coming from the standpoint of an educator, I'm seeing more women in the MDiv program. In terms of, I can talk about the academic discussion because I think it's very much tied. For scholars who take the Bible as authoritative, we've really moved to new ground where a lot of scholars, a lot of leading scholars that are highly respected are coming out with conviction and confidence and strong support for women in all levels of ministry. I think that has had a tremendous impact. Mm-hmm. And the internet has really been a help with this. I think that there's been a certain shift around 2016, 2017, where all of a sudden things felt different. And it's much brighter, but yes, it's slow, it's incremental. And we want to be patient with that.
Yeah, the change can be excruciatingly slow, can't it? It's like baby steps. or yes, crumbs of progress, my colleague likes to say, crumbs of progress, and that's kind of how it feels sometimes. Cindy, I don't want to pass up the opportunity for you to just give us a little synopsis of your book, and I think for those who are kind of trying to work through the scriptures and kind of gender roles, your book would probably be a good reference point. So Cindy, if you can just tell us a little bit about your book.
Let me frame it a little bit. I just saw a video by Tisby, who's the author of How to Fight Racism. And he had a very interesting point where he said that maybe the discussion needed to move forward from the analysis of the problem to the analysis of the solution. And one thing he said is that we need to approach this. Everybody needs to approach this with a coherent frame. And that's what I tried to do in Paul and Gender. I talked about, first of all, it wasn't just a women's book. It talked about Paul and what he taught about men and women. And by doing that, one of the things I was really bringing out is that different hermeneutics were used for the passages on men than they were for the passages on women. And what's worse is the passages that were directed to all believers were applied hermeneutically different to men than they were to women, and to try to be consistent with keeping women in seclusion out of ministry. And so I approached it more holistically, more in the context of Paul's teaching as a whole on major topics, and put the passages that have been used to exclude women from ministry into their bigger contexts. And I approached the word linguistically, in a linguistic analysis. That means I take into account its literary context and its sociocultural context. And so what I would say is that I applied evangelical hermeneutics to the text, and to me, it's uncontrovertible, and that the scripture supports women to follow Jesus and to use the abilities that he's given us without restrictions, and that's what comes out of it. Men too, all races, all social classes. There are no restrictions except for the calling that God places on us and our obedience to it. So I don't know. I don't always summarize it that way, but today that's how I'm summarizing it, is that I think that what I was trying to work with is a coherent frame in which we understand this. I think the more that we can all move forward into that and making our theology consistent with our practice is the way forward here.
Yes, that's excellent. So as female leaders, it's not always a bed of roses, is it? It's not always smooth sailing all the way, although, in an idealized world, we have, great support everywhere we go. As I know for myself, there have been times of great frustration as well. And I'm just wondering for you, what are your areas of frustration as female leaders?
Yeah, teaching has been mentioned a couple of times, and I think the lack of teaching that is happening in churches on, gender equity, that's very frustrating for me, because churches have the stance of, yes, we support women in leadership and ministry, but then there's no teaching done on it. So I find that those in the congregation, they don't have a biblical basis for believing that, and often they won't believe it. So I'll hear people talk still about male headship, and it's there in the Bible. So I think this is something that pastors need to be teaching from the pulpit. And then, I think the terminology that we use, I find very frustrating. Egalitarianism and complementarianism. I really don't like those terms. I don't think they accurately describe what they're trying to describe. What we're really talking about is a hierarchy and a power dynamic. So I would love it if we could not use those terms any longer, and call it what it is. It's a hierarchy, and we're teaching that women have a place and men have a place, and that's not what the Bible shows us. Cindy's book is great. It's a very dense read, but it shows that this is a biblical imperative. This is something that shows us God's view for men and women, and we need to be learning this if we're going to be people who are people of justice.
That's awesome, Abby. And I agree. And isn't it interesting how many different topics and topics of justice we'll preach about, but we don't preach about women in ministry, even in churches that have female pastors or support women in leadership. It's almost avoided talking about it directly, which is very interesting. So I love the explosion of resources around women in leadership. And Cindy's so grateful to hear of your work. But how do we help people access those and restudy the biblical passages themselves, the average person in the pew? So I agree with that frustration, Abby.
Mhm.
And the other frustration I would add is it's not the blatant situations where someone comes against you as a female in ministry. I feel like I can handle those. It's when people dismiss you because you think it's because of your gender, but you're not really sure. I find those difficult. Just wondering, was I excluded from that mentoring opportunity because I'm female, that mentoring group or that role, or was my idea dismissed or my voice not heard because of my gender, or is it something else? And I just find that difficult, even just self-reflection with the Lord at those moments. And what does it mean to honor my gift, honor my voice in those situations?
Oh, that is so true, Renee. That's again part of a bigger discussion of when discrimination takes place, and it's if you just can't grasp, you just can't even talking to people about it. You can't you yourself, other people can't say this wasn't you. This is your problem. And of course, once you bring it out in the open, you will find that this is behavior everywhere. So I think that what the two of you brought out is that there is actually a gap between church members and pastors that have gone to seminary. And that yes, that some, like I'm saying, academics are moving forward, the conversation's moving forward, but it's not always penetrating. I got to apologize. My dog is whining in the background. I should have put her in the basement. I can't control that, but at any rate, I'm trying to kind of keep her down. But yes, this is an issue, and this is related to two of my major frustrations, and this is an inconsistency between confession and behavior. When people say they support women in leadership, but they are slow to implement change, and they are just more comfortable with excluding women and kind of waiting for the right moment, for instance, or for other reasons. And that's a real frustration. A second frustration, well, I'll say it's the third one, because I agree with you with that division between people who are in the discussion and general church members. But the third real problem is the patterns of abuse and bullying towards women leaders. And there has been a reluctance among male leaders to confront and correct what's been unacceptable. Now, we have seen a change in that, a tide of change in that recently. Like I said, starting in 2016, 2017, all number of factors came together, but the Me Too and the Church Too movements. And in 2019, MacArthur's abuse of Beth Moore, public abuse of Beth Moore. And we are seeing now more people speaking out, but I still see women isolated and defenseless against that kind of thing, and even worse in our churches.
Yeah, thank you for highlighting that. You know, one of the really tragic outcomes of COVID is that around the world, we've just seen the setback of achieving gender equity in so many of the places where CBM works. And, you know, some of the statistics say we've been set back by about 20 years in gains that we've made in achieving gender equity. And at this point, it looks like it'll be over 100 years, which is a shocking statistic, that it would be over 100 years. So not in our lifetimes will this even be a reality. And how that impacts girls and young women around the world, I think the world doesn't even know what the impact of that really is, because all that lost potential of what those women can contribute to our world will never be known if they aren't given the opportunity. So what are some ways that you can give advice to people that are watching, just to say, what are ways that people can get involved and encouraged to help move this vast topic of achieving gender equity? How do we move that cause forward? What can we do? Because sometimes it can feel very distant, or it can feel like, oh, it's only happening in my little church, or it's only happening. This is a global issue that I think all of us need to be aware of. So what are some words of advice that you could give people?
Keep your eyes wide open. Pay attention, and take what I call take responsibility for your circle of influence and work in it. I think that this is really highlighted as one of the most important issues of our time. And as you were talking, I was thinking, are we talking about in the church? Are we talking about the global concerns? I mean, it's all acute. And but where do we take responsibility? And this is something I try to teach my students, is that we can become overwhelmed to the point that we're paralyzed, we can't move. And so I believe that God has placed a certain call in each of our lives, and those calls have boundaries. And so the thing is to not be overwhelmed by the complexity of the totality of the issue, but actually pray, keep your eyes wide open and pray to where God has placed you in this issue, and to focus on the specifics that he brings to your mind. And I guarantee you that your vision is going to be different than other people's vision. That's how the body of Christ works together. And so make it a priority, make it a focus, be attentive to information that's out there, but then have a very strong sense of where God is placing you in this. And one of the ways that you can do that is to simply look back at your own story, see where God has placed you and equipped you to address these things in your own life.
I agree, Cindy, and just don't stop talking about it, because I think we're tempted with so much going on in our world to bury this issue of inequality. And so don't keep talking about it, especially at key opportunities. Preach about it when there's opportunities to educate youth groups and others. Talk about it when there's opportunities because there's a fresh board position or a search committee. Talk about it. And then when you think worldwide, in some ways, COVID has allowed us to use technology to a greater degree than ever before. And so how can we use that to amplify voices, amplify women's voices from around the globe? And so now when you have a guest speaker spot, you don't have to fly someone in from across the country. Could you share your pulpit virtually with female leaders or speakers and greater diversity, or use leadership positions from around the globe and invite their voices in locally? I think we have some new opportunities for that. So yeah, just don't stop talking about it, educating people and educating yourself.
Yeah, that's such a great way of putting it. Now, as you're saying, Jennifer, the church will be 100 years behind. I'm thinking that the church has often been behind, on issues of justice. So maybe this is our chance to get ahead if culture is falling behind, and go back to thinking about representation. So yeah, as we're looking at our church leadership, make sure that we're having women in positions of leadership, and don't put that on women because women are tired. COVID has been exhausting because women have had to be everything. And I think if we can just take that pressure off of women and say, no, this is up to those in positions of leadership. And in a lot of our churches, that will be men. But to make sure that they are having women in positions of authority and leadership so that it's something very visible for everyone to see. And I think that will make a big difference, for the next generation, but also just for people of all ages in our churches to be able to see that, well, this is something the church can get right this time.
Well, we all love to see that, if the church was leading the way on this issue. And I think for me, I would say this is not a women's issue. Gender equity is not a women's issue. And until men are our allies on this issue and work with us to make change, nothing is going to change. And so that's what my biggest hope is, that we will have more allies in this fight. A fight for everyone to be treated as equals as created in God's image. So I want to thank you all so much for your words of wisdom today, for sharing your thoughts with us today. And I just want to let you know that I am so proud of each of you, to know each of you and the work that you do, the fantastic work that you do, and the ways that you live into the calling that God has given you. You are remarkable leaders, all of you, each in your own way. And I'm so thankful that you took the time to be on this call today. As we mark International Women's Day on March 8th, I want to say thank you to all of my female colleagues that work with me around the world, and also to all the women that we get to serve together through the work that we do. If you want to find out more about CBM's gender-based programming, go to CBM's website, www.cbmin.org.